Before the blue jean, engineering the workwear revolution. All right, welcome back to The Explainer. Since we're all about making you an absolute expert on everything denim, this one is right up your alley. I mean, if you're watching this, you probably work in the denim industry, right? You know the weaves, you know the washes, and you definitely know the year 1873. Honestly, it's basically tattooed on our collective brains at this point. But today, we're going to step outside our modern design studios and factories and take a look at the true and honestly, surprisingly crowded world that existed right before the blue jean took over. We're going to dig into the engineering revolution that actually birthed the product we all work with today. Okay, let's dive into this. As denim professionals, we have this bad habit of treating 1873 as year zero for workwear. But 19th century workers weren't just wandering around in delicate fabrics, crossing their fingers and waiting for someone to invent a durable pair of pants. The working world was already completely clothed. Farmers, miners, railway builders, factory workers, they all had practical clothing tailored to their specific labor. So it really begs the question, if they already had workwear, what on earth were they actually wearing when they went down into the mines or out into the fields? We've really got to challenge this assumption that jeans completely invented the category.
I want you to take a hard look at this date, 1830. Now, this might shock some of the purists in our field, but denim itself was already being used for work clothing decades before that famous rivet patent. No way, right? But it's true. In fact, the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology actually has denim work trousers dating all the way back to the 1830s or 1840s. That means a strong cotton twill, one that could be made in heavy weights and washed over and over again, was already out there on the market. The fabric we literally build our entire industry around today wasn't born in 1873. It was already doing the heavy lifting for early American laborers way before that.
But here's the reality check. Denim was absolutely not the universal clothing of the 19th century worker. There was no single, unified worker uniform. If you were to time travel and walk onto a job site before 1873, you'd see a massive, frankly chaotic variety of materials. Depending on a worker's specific job, the local climate, their income, and just regional customs, they might be wearing trousers made of wool, linen, or various heavy cottons. Wool, for instance, was incredibly important anywhere warmth was needed. So our beloved denim, it was truly just one option floating around in a highly competitive, super crowded market of practical clothing. Now, what's really interesting here is how we can contrast the two heavyweight champions of the pre-jean era. On one side, we had blue denim, which, as we all know, is a strong cotton twill. But right alongside it was brown cotton duck. And duck is a tightly woven, plain weave cotton cloth, rather than a twill, making it incredibly robust. Back in the mid-1800s, if you were a worker looking for tough pants, you were likely tossing up between these two powerhouse fabrics. They were pretty much the absolute peak of material durability at the time. To really understand why these super heavy fabrics were so necessary, you kind of have to picture the environmental hazards these folks faced daily. 19th century labor was relentless. I mean, just brutal on garments. Miners were constantly scraping against rough rock surfaces, covered in dirt, repeatedly bending down with heavy tools. Agricultural workers were battling soil and severe weather. Railway workers were literally lifting heavy equipment that caused extreme abrasion to their clothes. And factory workers faced wild temperature swings and aggressive, dangerous machinery. Every single day, these jobs were basically trying to rip a worker's clothes to shreds. So, the crucial point is this. Fabric weight alone simply wasn't enough to save a garment. You could be wearing the heaviest cotton duck or the absolute sturdiest denim, but the garments were still failing. Why? Well, because of the joining points. Seams, buttons, and especially pocket openings were just bursting. Picture a miner constantly shoving heavy, calloused hands and sharp tools into their pockets all day long. That constant pulling at those openings caused the fabric to tear right at the seams, even when the rest of the cloth was perfectly fine. This was the massive, glaring engineering flaw of the 19th century. But before we get to the solution for that flaw, we've got to look at the industrial forces that were changing how clothes were even made in the first place. This was the era of the ready-made revolution. It all started with standardized sizing, basically moving away from every single garment being individually tailored. Then, in the 1850s, the rapid spread of sewing machines created massive time savings compared to doing it all by hand. And finally, the American Civil War completely supercharged this system. They suddenly needed standardized uniforms produced and distributed on an unprecedented wholesale scale. Practically overnight, the infrastructure for mass-producing trousers was locked in. Simultaneously, the actual map of the United States was rapidly changing. The California gold rush was pulling miners, merchants, transport workers, and just massive amounts of capital out to the American West. Towns were exploding overnight, railways were growing, and this created an enormous new market for practical goods. But they were isolated. Massive, long-distance supply chains, like we're talking those overland trails stretching all the way across the map, had to be built to drag food, tools, cloth, and tough work clothing all the way across the country just to supply this booming Western workforce. And that brings us to a name we all know, Levi Strauss. But here's where we need to separate the myth from the man a little bit. When Strauss arrived in San Francisco in 1853, he wasn't there as some brilliant designer inventing a brand new garment. No, he was actually there establishing a Western branch of his family's dry goods business. He was a wholesaler, selling textiles, clothing, and related merchandise to retailers across the region. He was a total master of distribution and supply in a rapidly expanding territory. He wasn't, a manufacturer of one specific famous product. Not yet, anyway.
Now, meanwhile, over in Reno, Nevada, we have Jacob Davis. Davis was one of the many, many customers who bought cloth from Levi Strauss & Company. But Davis wasn't just making your standard trousers. Because he was a tailor in a pretty rough Western town, he was routinely working with incredibly tough materials, like that heavy brown cotton duck we talked about earlier. In fact, he was actually using it to make non-apparel, heavy-duty goods, things like tents and wagon covers. So he really understood how to manipulate industrial-grade materials well outside the realm of ordinary, delicate tailoring. And this brilliantly illustrates the absolute perfect storm that created our industry. It's like a giant puzzle coming together. You have the 1850s giving us the sewing machines required for mass production. Then, by 1853, Levi Strauss is out west building this massive supply network. Fast forward to the 1870s, and you have established trouser forms and super durable fabrics moving efficiently through those exact distribution networks. And then, Jacob Davis realizes that by taking metal fasteners, rivets, and applying them to the vulnerable pockets of work pants, he could completely solve that durability problem we talked about earlier. In 1873, they patent this idea together. Now, as Denim Insiders, here's a fantastic little Easter egg of history to keep in your back pocket. The breakthrough here was entirely structural, not material. The rivet was the game changer, not the cloth. In fact, the very first commercially riveted trousers made by Levi Strauss and Jacob Davis were actually produced in both blue denim and brown cotton duck. It wasn't limited to just one fabric at first. It was only later on that denim became the material we basically exclusively associate with jeans. So let's wrap this up and see how this builds a whole new perspective for us. The most important takeaway here is that jeans did not create the workwear category, not even close. They entered a deeply established market that was already filled with wool, linen, and canvas pants being mass-produced and shipped out west. But the riveted jean completely dominated that crowded space. Why? Because it offered a superior engineering solution to a specific, catastrophic point of failure, the ripping pocket. It hit the nail right on the head. So, I leave you, the future of the denim industry, with this thought. A tiny piece of metal, just applied to a seam, completely revolutionized global apparel in 1873 by solving a structural problem. As we look at the challenges in our industry today, whether we're talking about sustainability, circularity, or crazy new textile technology, ask yourselves, what is the structural innovation we're currently missing? Honestly, what is the rivet of our generation? Thanks for exploring this with me, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.